Okay. All right, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Miriam Wright was born in Stephenville Crossing, the same as me, but her family left the island when she was 2 years old. She grew up in southwestern Ontario and did a Bachelor of Arts degree in history at the University of Western Ontario. While at Queen's University, where she did her master's in history, she reconnected with the place of her birth by writing a thesis on the Newfoundland fishery. This led to her to Memorial University, where she did her PhD on the fishery during the Smallwood years, which she revised and published under the title A Fishery for Modern Times, the State of the Newfoundland Fishery from 1934 to 1968. I have that book, and I recommend it to anyone interested in Newfoundland history generally, and certainly the fishery. It's an indispensable work for that period. She eventually landed at the University of Windsor, where she has been teaching since 2003. While on her first sabbatical, she and Robert Hong worked together on a public history project on the Chinese in Newfoundland. She continued that research, resulting in an article published in the Acadiensis entitled The Most Modern Dining Hall in the City, Chinese Immigrants, Restaurants, and Social Spaces in St. John's, Newfoundland, 1918 to 1945. Recently, she has worked on another community-based public history project on the Chatham Colored All-Stars, a Black baseball team from the 1930s. Later this year, her monograph, Sporting Justice, the Chatham Colored All-Stars and Black Baseball in Southwestern Ontario, 1915 to 1958, will be published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Robert Hong was born in St. John's to a father originally from Southeast China and a white mother from Trinity Bay. When he was very young, Robert and his family moved to Stephenville, where his father ran a restaurant, the Radio Lunch. The family moved back to St. John's when Robert was 10 years old, and his father continued in the restaurant business with the House of Hong on Harvey Road at the bottom of Barnes Road, as I recall. After leaving school, Robert worked as a marine oiler on Department of Fisheries and Oceans patrol vessels. He then left the marine field for Memorial University, where he earned a BA honors and a Master's of Arts in History. In 1987, his honors dissertation on the Chinese in Newfoundland, entitled To Take Action Without Delay, Newfoundland's Chinese Immigration Act of 1906, won the David Alexander Prize for the best essay written by an undergraduate student on the history of Atlantic Canada. In the mid-2000s, Robert spearheaded the head tax redress movement in Newfoundland and Labrador and was a founding member of a group that developed a public history project on the Chinese in Newfoundland, including a monument in downtown St. John's and a photographic exhibit at the Center for Newfoundland Studies. As a result of these contributions, he received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. Robert also has been the owner and manager of Time Masters, a comic book and pop culture store, for over 30 years. And I will say that Bob has also done some excellent work on what I would call the ecological history of the fishery around the development and use of the cod trap. And he's also done some major work on the Board of Trade in the first decades of the 20th century. So without further ado, I ask you to welcome Miriam Wright and Robert Hong. And they'll now begin their presentation under the title, From a Sojourner's Life for Family Reunification, Reflections on Experiences of Chinese Immigration in Newfoundland, 1890s to 1950s. So Miriam, Robert, Miriam,
I guess I'll go first with this. We're going to do a tag team here tonight. I'm going to start with the first bit, beginning at the 1840s and moving up to the Newfoundland section in 1906 and the Chinese Immigration Act. Miriam will take it from there and explore the many ways in which the Chinese adapted to their new home here in Newfoundland. I thought I'd go backwards in time to examine the essentially the great upheaval in the Chinese state and the first and most disastrous European contacts. As you may or may not know, there were two opium wars back in the 19th century, in the 1840s and the 1860s. Specifically, the first one was 1839 to 42, and the second opium war was in 1856 to 1860. Essentially, you can read more about this on the internet. It was a trade imbalance whereby the British were importing tea, silks, and porcelain, but the Chinese weren't buying anything back from them until the British discovered that, well, we can sell them opium that we grew in India. At some point, the officials in China said, "Oh, we got to stop this stuff." And in an effort to suppress the opium trade, they started restricting the trade. Well, this didn't go well. By this time, by 1838, some 40,000 chests of opium were imported annually, and a chest was about 140 pounds average. That's about 5.6 million pounds of opium that was flowing into China by British trade. Well, the British didn't like that. They declared war, and the Chinese lost. I guess you could read this into Guns, Germs, and Steel by Niall Ferguson. With great technology, of course, the British did win. With that, the first of the unequal treaties were enacted. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 imposed reparations upon the Chinese, and Hong Kong Island, that great port, was ceded to the British for 150 years. This made it easier for people to move out of China during the years that followed, where there was much violence and unrest, including the Taipei Rebellion. There was also widespread famine, natural disasters, and huge economic problems stemming from the importation of cheap British goods. Tens of thousands departed in the 19th century from Southeast China, Guangdong province, into many of the white settler colonies, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the United States, and Canada. By the 1850s, the Chinese were encouraged to move to North America by a host of pull factors. Now, within immigration, we kind of allow both a push factor and a pull factor. And in Newfoundland, we have seen this over its history for the past couple of hundred years, where the economy will push people out, are drawn to other parts of the world to work, and with that, money is sent back home to sustain the families. We see this during the 1940s, when Newfoundlanders are moving to New York and the Boston states. We see this in the 1950s with Newfoundlanders moving to Toronto. We see this in the 60s and 70s, where Newfoundlanders are moving to Vancouver, and we see this in the 90s and aughts, moving towards Alberta. These push and pull factors, I mean, are part of what I call, or what I view as kind of a shared affinity with the Chinese and the Newfoundlanders. In, I guess, many cases, it's great to stay home and work and provide for your family, but in the absence of sustainable work, you just have to move on. But in the 1850s, many of the Chinese start moving towards North America, And this is where the legend of Gold Mountain comes in. The gold rushes of California, BC, the Fraser Valley, and the Yukon draw many Chinese to North America with the idea of work and maybe getting rich and then going back home and, you know, becoming a man of the community. In the 1860s as well, following the American Civil War, you have quite a number of Chinese being imported to the United States to build the Pacific Railroad. With this as well, they're being paid maybe $1 to $3 a day, with some actually receiving less. And the bulk of the railroad construction was made possible by cheap disposable labor provided by the Chinese. In the 1880s, of course, we have railway construction in Canada, 1881 to 1815, with some 15,000 Chinese laborers imported, working on the most dangerous tasks. Hundreds died from accidents, winter cold, malnutrition, and illness. Here they were paid $1 a day and had to pay for their own provisions. White workers, $1.50 to $2.50 per day, and were provided with provisions. It's interesting to note that in the famous picture of the last bike, the Chinese workers were cleared from the pit. Yeah. After the CPR was completed in 1885, Canada imposed a head tax, an entry fee, if you will, of $50 on Chinese immigrants to discourage immigration. They had passed, and Canada just didn't want them anymore. For a number of reasons. Often the Chinese were seen as a decrepit kind of underclass race that would never be able to assimilate with the great white cultures in Canada. In 1900, the entry fee was raised to $100 per person. That still didn't stop many of the Chinese coming here. And in 1904, this was raised to $500 per person. With this, of course, there was a great deal of not only state discrimination, but there was, the local discrimination amongst the people who lived surrounding them. In 1907, in September, 3 days of rioting broke out in Vancouver, where many of the businesses were ransacked and vandalized. In 1923, the Canadian government, of course, brought in an outright ban on Chinese immigration. And this was on the 1st of July, 1923, known on the mainland as the Day of Humiliation. With the completion of the CPR, it allowed the Chinese to traverse the Rocky Mountains and set up communities across the prairies, into Ontario, and towards the Maritimes. The first Chinese that we've found, we see them coming in 1895, when the Evening Telegram reports 2 Chinese men arrived on the SS Paulina. By late August 1895, the Sung Lee Laundry opens on New Gower Street. And this is the site of the monument that we have downtown. For the most part, the Chinese, not only here but in Canada, excuse me, worked on the margins of the economy, essentially doing cooking and cleaning. By 1904, there was a growing alarm about the Chinese in Newfoundland that the numbers would swell and soon take over jobs occupied by white labor. In 1904, the House of Assembly and the Legislative Council debated this, but at the Legislative Council, it was decided that, well, there was no need at this point to bring in such legislation, as there were such few people here. 2 years later, in 1906, the government does pass an act respecting Chinese persons, and each Chinese person entering Newfoundland must then pay $300, equivalent to what we figure was 2 to 3 years' wages. And for many that did come here and pay this, they borrowed the money, and it took years to pay this money back. Now, initially, the legislation required a $500 head tax, with some legislators wanting $1,000 per person. But eventually, they settled on a tax of $300, and the legislation in and of itself was modeled upon the Canadian. There was a great fear that the Chinese would continue to arrive and overwhelm local white labor, as recent arrivals, excuse me again, by train from Port aux Basques convinced many of the House of Assembly that it was time to take action. Also, during this time, you had a debate within the Legislative Council, also asking for the restriction of the Maronites, people from Lebanon, who they viewed as a threat to local trades. In this, Simon Touton and Kaleem Noah are prominent within the newspapers. Excuse me again. And they objected to this. The Chinese hand laundries, the growth of them were set up and the movement of the people were set up along a chain migration, providing service, like I said, on the margins of the economy, cooking and cleaning. The laundries were able to maintain a viable economy for the Chinese migrants, and reached a peak of over 20. Excuse me again. I picked up a cold on Saturday. And by the 1930s, there was some 20 laundries. Later, with the pooling of resources and saving of money, many of the Chinese branched out in the snack bars, cafes, and restaurants. And here I'm just going to tremendous amount of violence within St. John's over the Chinese. There was many beatings of people caught out alone, and there was quite a number of incidents where, excuse me again, where the back door of restaurants and hand laundries were knocked on, and then when the men would come out to answer, they'd be pelted with offal, or rocks, and in winter, of course, snowballs. I remember when we were up on Harvey Road, this happened at least once a month, and it got to the point where we just didn't answer the back door anymore. So, but there was a tremendous amount of violence. I'm just not going to go into that, but needless to say, they one kept to oneself, and one didn't cause any trouble, especially for the kids. If you got beat up at school, you were told, don't cause any trouble, right? So anyway, we're just going to pass this on to Miriam, and hopefully her microphone will work out, and she'll be talking about the adaptation.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so how is this sounding? Okay. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm very happy to be here. Now I'm going to continue on, talk a little bit more about the hand laundries, and then continue talking about the restaurant. Now the hand laundries that the Chinese immigrants opened and operated in St. John's are an important part of the story. Not only were they the foundation for the lives of the people of Chinese heritage in the city, but their historic existence also challenges us to think about the history of St. John's differently. Laundries were the means of survival for the hundreds of Chinese men who came to Newfoundland in the first half of the 20th century. And like their compatriots in other parts of North America, Chinese immigrants to Newfoundland turned to laundries and domestic service industries because of the racism they faced in trying to find work. Laundries were also a pathway for chain migration, as established laundry owners would pay the head tax of relatives and friends who arrived from China, who would in turn work to pay off their debt. Some would eventually save enough money to open businesses of their own, and then it was their turn to sponsor sons and grandsons, nephews and cousins to come to Newfoundland, and the cycle continued. And note that these were all male relatives. The Newfoundland Immigration Act did not bar Chinese women from coming to Newfoundland, but the cost, and what I suspect was actually some deliberately misleading impression that the government officials may have given to members of the Chinese community, meant that almost all of the population from China who came to Newfoundland before 1949 were male. The whole generations of men spent their adult lives without wives and female relatives living with them. Some Chinese immigrants married white Newfoundland-born women and raised families with them, but for the most part, it was a lonely life and the work was hard. Laundries were also important because of their impact on the commercial landscape of St. John's in the late 19th and early 20th century. The city was growing with a diversifying economy, providing opportunities for middle and working class alike. Commercial laundries fit into a growing service sector that was developing along with the city. Many of the earliest Chinese laundries the Chinese immigrants founded were on New Gower Street, a diverse working class neighborhood that also included the island's newcomers from what is now Lebanon, who also contributed to the local economy through their retail shops and services. And as you can see from this slide, over time, this is a map of the laundries that we have plotted that existed in Newfoundland in the first half of the 20th century. They started around New Gower Street and then branched off into the other neighborhoods of St. John. At their peak, as Bob mentioned, there were probably about 24 operating. This is probably in the early 1930s. Now, I'm going to show you some images of these laundries, and keep in mind that how we see them now is different from how the early 20th century Chinese immigrants would have seen or understood them. Today, we see photos of ordinary buildings on streets that we may recognize. But for the Chinese people in the early 20th century in St. John's, these buildings would have represented the families, the clans, the specific villages in China where the people operating them came from. For example, in the 1930s, someone from the Chinese community walking along Queens Road would have seen a laundry operated by the Tom family who came from Huiping or Kaiping in Guangdong province in China. And if they kept walking east, they would arrive at Gower Street to see the laundry run by Hongs from Dai Long, which was a village in Taishan County, Guangdong, which was near Macau. In this way, the streets of St. John's were directly linked to villages in China, adding layers of complexity to the cultural and economic geography of the city. These buildings were entry points for the movement of people from China to Newfoundland and back again. They were figurative pieces of China in St. John's. And the city looks different when we acknowledge that. I think it would be interesting to do another laundry map similar to the one here, but with the villages marked on them. This is the laundry that people from Dai Long ran. This was the laundry that the Owls ran. This is the family. This is the laundry that the Junes ran, and so on. It's also important to that we're used to thinking about Newfoundland's connection to the Atlantic world, but I think thinking about the laundries and sort of their presence in St. John's also reminds us of the very direct connections that Newfoundland had to the Pacific world. And also, it's important to think about the other way. Think about all the thousands of people who live in China today who are descended from people who had spent their working lives in Newfoundland, sending money back to sustain their families back home. There must be thousands of them, and I wonder how many of them are aware of their Newfoundland connection. So I'm just going to go through these pictures. This is from the lovely St. John's insurance maps, showing the location of the very first Chinese laundry that we know of. It was on New Gower, corner of Holdsworth Street. You can see it's right by that little blue dot in the center. It sat there, was from 1895, and then sometime before 1908, the name changed to the UV Laundry, and suggesting that it had a change of ownership, and moved over to the opposite corner on the other side of Holdsworth Street. And it remained there until the 1960s. Okay, and this is the Hopwa Laundry on Casey Street. This was another old laundry established before 1908 and operated until the 1940s. The owner initially was someone identified as Hopwa in the 1921 census, but all the other people living at that address had the surname Hong, which suggests to me that Hopwa his real name was probably Hong as well. In 1935 and 1945, the proprietor was identified as someone named Ern Hong. He had been in Newfoundland since 1903, and in 1947, he returned to China, and it is not known if he ever came back. He may not have, because sometimes it was a pattern for men to spend their working lives in Newfoundland. As they became older, they would return to China, and they would send someone else back from the family in his place. So that Ern Hong may not have ever come back to Newfoundland. Just a couple of other pictures. This you may recognize as a mural on Tablet Street, using that Hopwa Laundry picture as a backdrop. And okay, sorry. And this is another picture of that Hopwa Laundry, just a different view. That building is no longer there. This is the Jim Lee Laundry. This is probably one of the longest running laundries in the city. It was founded sometime before 1908. It was at the top of Carter's Hill, and it was there until the 1960s. And in fact, that building is still there. The front's been changed. It's been turned back into a house. But if you go look down the top of Carter's Hill, you'll see it, the old Jim Lee Laundry. And this is the Jim Gay Laundry on New Gower Street. This building is not there. This was on the north side near Waldegrave Street. It's part of the big stretches of New Gower Street that was raised for the development on New Gower Street, the hotels, the city hall, and so on. This particular laundry was built in the 1920s, and again was there until it was torn down in the 1960s. And this is the Soon Lee Laundry on Monkstown Road. sort of on the island, where sort of in behind what used to be a photography shop. This laundry was built sometime between 1915 and 1919. There had been a laundry there even before that, but it burned down in 1915. Laundry, of course, fires at laundries were a common hazard just because of the heating up water, having to use sort of hot implements. And there were a number of tragic and fatal fires in the laundry. That's the location where that laundry was, that little island part at Rollins Cross. Okay, so besides laundries, Chinese immigrants also owned and operated restaurants and cafes in St. John's. These public eating places, like the laundries, offer a way to think more deeply about both the experience of people of Chinese heritage who worked in them and the larger history of the city. The first restaurants were opened in 1919, but they served the same role as the laundry, providing a way for Chinese immigrant men to live and survive. This is important because by the 1920s, the number of laundries in the city had reached a saturation point. And immigrants who wanted to start new businesses often turned to restaurants instead. Bob's father, for example, when he first arrived in Newfoundland, worked in a laundry. We think of the laundry on Gower Street. But after a few years, he left the laundry business, probably after he finished paying off his head tax, and moved into the restaurant sector. He first worked on restaurants in Belle Island, and then went on to the island of St. Pierre, the French island of St. Pierre for a time, and then came back to St. John's in the early 1940s to open the United Nations restaurant, which was on Gower Street. I'm going to show you. This is a picture of Bob's dad. That's Bob's dad on the right, Jean Home. And the person on the left is Li Liang, who was his partner at the United Nations restaurant. This picture was taken in the 1930s. And this picture here, the one we used for our poster, was taken in 1944. Also shows Bob's father and Li Liang. Bob's father is the one seated on the far right. Li Liang is standing on the far left. The rest of the men, though, it's an interesting picture. The rest of the men were from Belle Island, worked in restaurants in Belle Island, the Hollywood Cafe and the Imperial Cafe. And what's interesting about this picture as well is that all the other men, their surname was also Hong. Now, when you see the name Hong in St. John's, they're not all necessarily related. Quite often they are not. But many of the Hongs in St. John's in this period were all from the same village. They're all from this village called Dai Long, which I'm told is down near Macau. So what this picture probably represents, again, are the sort of the ties that kind of carried over into the St. John's life. Bob's dad may have gone to Belle Island because his fellow villagers were already working there. And, you know, they remained friends ever since. So again, it shows the way that, you know, these family and clan ties get reconstituted in St. John's and have a role in the way that, you know, these business and community connections are made. And you'll see these connections all over. You can get the ties between the different restaurants and the laundries in the restaurant. I mentioned that laundry on Queens Road that was owned by the Tom family from Haiping. They were connected to a restaurant on Water Street that operated in the 1930s called the American Cafe. So people would come from Haiping. They worked for the laundry for a bit and then moved down to the restaurant. So these kinds of connections are sort of all throughout it's almost like a web, these connections between the laundries, the restaurants, and at the heart of it, of course, are these family and clan sort of ties that are sort of the basis for these businesses. Another point I want to make, and a point that I've made before, is the huge impact that Chinese immigrants had on developing the restaurant sector in St. John's and Newfoundland as a whole. Chinese immigrants not only brought a restaurant culture to St. John's, a city with few eating places outside of hotels and boarding houses, also owned the majority of eating establishments in the interwar years. In 1936, for example, 60 of 29 restaurants were owned by Chinese immigrants. And in 1946, it was 18 of 27. These restaurants were also quite differentiated in terms of sort of market and clientele. Restaurants established along Water Street, particularly sort of in amongst the banks and the merchant houses, tended to be a little bit more of a middle class market, a little bit fancier. There were others that were in working class neighborhoods, including New Gower Street and Water Street. These tended to be more working class. You can sort of tell by the kinds of advertisements these various restaurants have. Higher class ones, these middle class ones would advertise, fancy dinners. For example, the White Lily on Water Street advertised merchant's lunch, whatever merchant's lunch is, and high class meals at reasonable prices. Whereas the other restaurants would advertise things like fish and chips dinners and the 35-cent meal specials, that kind of thing. I'm going to show you some pictures here. Should note that these restaurants mostly did not serve what we consider Chinese style food in this period. It wasn't until after World War II, beginning in the 1950s, that we see Chinese style food really being introduced to St. John. A couple of old pictures of restaurants. This is down where the convention center is now. There's a couple of restaurants visible right sort of in that middle block there. Something with the awning is called the Western Cafe, which is owned by Sam King. Two doors down is a restaurant that later became the London Cafe. London Cafe, owned by the Au family. Ningong Au was the founder. That restaurant was there from the 1930s up into the 1960s, I believe 1970. That is a picture of the Silver Ball restaurant, which was on Duckler Street. That's William Ping, one of the probably more well-known Chinese immigrants who arrived in the 1930s. He didn't own that restaurant. I'm not quite sure why he was standing there, but that is a good picture of the old Silver Ball. Now, these businesses offered for their Chinese immigrants owner, besides a way to make a living, also a path for greater visibility and respectability. Clues can be found in reports about the opening of a couple of the early restaurants, the Pink Cafe and the Dominion Cafe, both on Water Street, just after the First World War. Both owners invited prominent members of the white community in St. John's, politicians, merchants, clergymen to their restaurant opening, which was a smart business move, but it also connected the owners to that social sphere. For example, when Charlie Fong, who opened the King Cafe in 1919, he invited members of House of Assembly and later Judge W.J. Higgins to give a speech. Likewise, longtime St. John's resident and leader of the Chinese community, Kim Lee, invited no less than 3 members of the House of Assembly, including Higgins, John Anderson, and W.R. Howley, to the 1920 opening of his Water Street restaurant. The reporter for the Daily News covering the event was greatly impressed with the quality of the decor described it as beaverboard, painted snow white. He's also impressed with the chef, who apparently came from Montreal, and the up-to-date ice cream parlor. The writer explained, "The whole place is laid out to perfection and reflects great credit on the enterprising firm of Kim Lee and Company. Clearly, the restaurants were a way of gaining respect and perhaps acceptance in a place where Chinese immigrants had encountered a lot of hostility." You also note that these restaurants, being public places, were also occasionally sites of violence. There are many, many reports of white men damaging property, fighting, stealing, and assaulting the restaurant workers, and reaching a height during World War II when thousands of service people from the US and Canada arrived in St. John's. One of the worst incidents would happened on Christmas night, 1941, when Newfoundland Navy men who were walking by the Imperial restaurant on Water Street, where Chinese men were having dinner together. They saw them. They broke into the restaurant. They broke the windows, broke down the doors, started assaulting the Chinese men who were, just trying to have a dinner together. It turned into a riot. More Navy men arrived. People started fighting. The military police were finally called in to clear it up. But as you can imagine, this incident greatly upset members of the Chinese community. In fact, they asked for a meeting with the mayor to address it. But it's, this is obviously one extreme case. Most restaurant interactions were not this fraught. But it is a reminder of the continued vulnerability that Chinese immigrants had living in essentially racist society. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this, but I think what's important is that during World War II, Chinese people in St. John's became very, very prominent in their fundraising activities, and certainly partly because of the way that the war was having a direct impact on the lives of their friends and families and communities back home. In fact, during the war, some Chinese immigrants lost contact with their families altogether, didn't know if they were alive or dead. So that really spurred the kind of commitment that they had to fundraising for the war. So they were involved in all kinds of projects, whether it's the Red Cross, the Newfoundland Patriotic Fund, or the China War Relief Association. But apart from this, the war fundraising efforts really gave the Chinese community a greater platform for visibility and a platform to make a claim for respectability. It was they were very sort of public about their their engagements, about their fundraising activities. They would hold large public events. They would invite prominent people, politicians, the mayor, to come and sort of take part in this. So in many ways, this was a sort of seen as a path not only to respectability but also to potential citizenship. Over and over again, you see in the newspapers, the names of prominent restaurant owners and of other members of the community who were taking part in this project. I'll just show you a couple of slides. This is a picture of the Thai May Society in St. John's. A number of the members of the Chinese community formed what we call clan associations. These were kind of like benevolent societies that were kind of almost like a fraternal order. They were also used as mutual support, and if members of the community were, forming a business, they could get some resources and support through these societies. This was the Clan Society of the Ao, the Taimei Society. The Taimei Society is very prominent during the World War II years, particularly taking part in fundraising and so on. So this, of course, building, of course, is still there. It's now a restaurant, but you see a number of mentions of the Taimei Society. There's also a society made up of the Hongs and the Jin, called the Taimei, the Hong Hang Society, and they were located on William. Again, newspaper articles like this, right? Very prominent, first page of a newspaper, picture of prominent members of the community. That's Davy Fong sitting there, bottom right. On the left is Kim Lee, very prominent member of the community. In the middle is Mayor Carnell. Again, Union Jack in the background. This was a very important time for members of the Chinese community to really go public, to sort of assert their presence in the community, to say, we are doing good things. And this is probably one of the most iconic pictures of the Chinese community, taken in 1940 when the Chinese consul to Canada came to Newfoundland for a visit. And speeches were had, politicians, prominent members of the community were all invited to these events. And finally, the head tax finally ends, but not because Newfoundland rescinded it. In fact, Newfoundland never did rescind the head tax. It only ended because Newfoundland joined Canada in 1949, and Canada had ended their head tax in 1947. So it was really Confederation that basically paved the way for the Chinese immigrants in Newfoundland to apply for citizenship and to bring their families to join them in Newfoundland. Some of the men had already become naturalized British subjects, so did not need to make that application. But the majority would have gone through that process when the opportunity arose. In fact, the Evening Telegram reported that by September 1949, 40 Chinese men had already applied for citizenship, noting that some had been in Newfoundland for as long as 36 years. First citizenship ceremonies were held in early 1951, and the stories of the men who received those first citizenship certificates reveal the resilience and the hardship experienced by these Chinese people who came to Newfoundland. Families separated, sometimes for decades, were reunited. People such as Jim Yuk of Bell Island, who had been in Newfoundland since 1932. After 1949, he brought his wife and daughter to join him, and they subsequently had 2 more children they raised together while running their Bell Island confectionery. Gene Hong, Bob's father, brought his 5 younger brothers to Newfoundland and helped them get set up in their new lives. In fact, a whole new generation of reunited or newly formed families began, and many opened the cafes and snack bars that some of you may remember from St. John's and throughout Newfoundland in the 1950s and 1960s. I'll show you a picture here. Wedding taken in the early 1950s. Wedding, this is at Gower Street in United Church between George Au and his wife. They eventually moved out to Stephenville. But again, this was a new site for the Chinese community in Newfoundland. A wedding, something that most Newfoundlanders would have taken for granted, would have been something very, very special for the Chinese community in Newfoundland. Still, although there are many happy stories about family reunifications, still it can't have been easy. And as a historian, I wonder how it was for those families adjusting to their new lives after many years of separation. For example, what was it like for those families with older children born in China and younger children born in Newfoundland. There'd be sort of this sort of divide within families who had very different sort of generational experiences. The larger question remains about the degree of acceptance in a place such as Newfoundland that had long had a very white identity with its cultural markers in Britain and Ireland. We do know, however, that the Chinese community has historically been a much significant part of Newfoundland Labrador's history, and acknowledging it means having to recalibrate how we think about it and how we share it with the world. Okay. And that's it.
Okay, hello again. Thanks very much. A very interesting presentation, and we already can see, I can see Margot Dooley has her hand up. So Leah Griffiths is going to manage the chat line and also the raised hand function, and I'll ask Leah to acknowledge Margot Dooley, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, Margot, go ahead.
Thank you. I hope I'm allowed 2 questions. One is a very personal one. I lived at number 7 Monkstown Road, right across from the Sun Lee laundry. And I went in there many, many a time, earning my allowance as a child, bringing in the laundry and getting it back. And I remember at the kind of front counter, there were younger Chinese men who were very outgoing, spoke perfect English. I suspect perhaps some of them had been in Newfoundland for quite some time. But family mythology had it, and I'm wondering if it was a mythology. There was a very old gentleman who sat at the rear, who kind of supervised what was going on. And the mythology, maybe it isn't, was that he was a high-ranking member of the Chiang Kai-shek government who had had to flee. And I'm wondering if this is true or whether it was just fantasy on the part of people in the neighborhood. Any idea?
Bob, have you ever heard that story?
Perhaps it could be fantasy.
We do know that Chiang Kai-shek was that he was revered amongst some of the immigrants. There was I remember hearing stories about like drawings and paintings of Chiang Kai-shek, you know, that people had. So I know that there was some interest and connection to him. But that's all I can say.
The broader question is this. I've actually been going through the St. John's voters lists for the 1930s. And I've noticed, I couldn't give you an exact number, but I would say it was probably 5 or 6 Chinese men who clearly had become naturalized British citizens, because that was a requirement to vote in the municipal election, just as it was in the national election. I'm wondering, A, how common it was to become naturalized, A, and B, if you were naturalized, was there a way around the head tax? Because it seems to me there's a huge legal contradiction between the rights of a British citizen and the head tax.
Well, I can tell you just from looking at the census records that there were a small handful of a small number of people who had become naturalized British subjects, but probably maybe I would count, you know, less than a dozen or so, like not many. So it wasn't that common, but certainly there were people like Kim Lee, I think, was naturalized British subject.
Yeah.
Members of the Fong family were naturalized British subjects. But as far as we can tell, there was no, you know, there was no exception for British subjects with the head tax. Bob, do you have any comments on that?
Well, that would have been absolutely in contradiction to British law at the time, which is another example of discrimination.
It was certainly a point that they brought up during the debates in the legislature as to what effect this might have on naturalized British subjects coming from Hong Kong, but I don't think it was really that much of a concern. The concern, of course, was that it was that great fear of Chinese coming here and overwhelming whether they were naturalized British subjects or not.
Mhm.
One interesting sort of side piece to that story is that in the mid 1940s, a couple of Chinese men who were naturalized British subjects wanted to bring their wives over, and they hired a lawyer, and
Wow.
and the lawyer, communicated with the government and said, my clients would like to bring their wives over. They're naturalized British subjects. They're willing to pay the head tax for them. What do you think? And these officials, it was like in the Department of Justice, they went back and forth trying to think of any excuse that they could come up with to say we can't allow them to come in. But see, what happened is they eventually contacted the British colonial office in Britain, and they said those women, because they are married to naturalized British subjects, under the law, they are naturalized British subjects. And so they really can't, you can't prevent them from coming. So that was interesting. Now, they kind of fudged it, and they sounds like they delayed getting back to them. And so the women ended up not coming over until after 1950. But it is sort of an interesting question and a kind of interesting kind of dilemma.
Yeah. Thank you.
Clarence Thomas asks, who were the first Chinese to arrive in Newfoundland, and what was the common point of entry? Was Catalina a recognized point of entry?
Catalina.
Catalina. I'm not from here.
I'm pretty sure there were two routes. There was the one route across the Pacific into Vancouver, going inbound across Canada and to North Sydney, and then North Sydney to Port aux Basques, paying the head tax, and then Port aux Basques to St. John's. But there were a number of Chinese immigrants who came from Liverpool. I don't think they were actually from Liverpool, and I'm not sure of the steamship routes from out of Hong Kong into Liverpool. And Liverpool at the time was this great entrepot that managed quite a number of steamship lines. So it's from Liverpool to St. John's. So there were a number of Chinese that were coming from during that route. I don't know if that answers it.
That's a good answer.
And Marilyn Fradsham says, I remember Wong's restaurant on Pennywell Road in the 1960s. We would meet students from other high schools there. When leaving the restaurant, Mr. Wong would politely hold the door open for us, thank us for coming, and wish us a good night. I also remember hearing that the Snow White Laundry on Aldershot did excellent cleaning and pressing of men's dress shirts for 10 cents. And then Gloria asks, did the Chinese, sort of answered this, did the Chinese enter Canada via BC and travel to the East Coast, or did they arrive by boat to St. John's? And then Joan Hodson says, very interesting and enlightening information. I have an aunt who married a Chinese man in New York City and experienced discrimination in housing. My 2-year-old brother died of scarlet fever in the 30s and was buried in a pauper's area of the Forest Road Cemetery, quote, with the Chinese babies, unquote. The terrible indignities and ostracism visited on the poor and immigrant populations were unconscionable. Could you comment on Chinese religious practices or conversions and burial options? Also, who were the customers of the laundries and restaurants, and was this an entree into knowledge of the restaurant business?
I can talk a little bit about Chinese funerals. And of course, Chinese were well known throughout North America for their very elaborate funeral ceremonies, and particularly their processions that they would hold. They would hold almost like a parade through the streets, carrying the casket, decorated with flowers. Sometimes in other parts of North America, they would have bands, marching bands sort of traveling along with them. So death was taken very, very seriously. And we see that same thing happening in Newfoundland from very, very early years. The Chinese community took great care when one of their members died, as far back as 1903, 1904. There was newspaper reports of, I think it was a Mr. Wong who died, and his richly decorated casket was taken by a horse and carriage through the city streets. His fellow countrymen followed along behind, and apparently so did local residents of St. John's. He said that boys and girls, men and women sort of followed along and marched with this procession down to the cemetery. I think that cemetery was the one that's down by Kitty Vitty.
It's the old Protestant cemetery.
Yeah. And so this was, and there's all kinds of accounts in the newspapers of these elaborate, processions. They started holding annual flower services by 1908, 1909, where they would again hire a bunch of carriages and travel down to the cemetery, lay flowers, and then get together for a banquet. So yeah, I would say that was a very big deal for the Chinese community in St. John.
Thank you. And Stephen Wolinetz asks, what relations, if any, existed between the Chinese community and other immigrant communities, such as the Jewish community?
I wouldn't think that there would have been much of a contact, but there could well have been contact in the restaurants and in the hand laundries for those from other ethnic communities who frequented there. It's just a guess, but my guess is that most of the men kept to themselves. I don't think they would have been out in the wider community establishing links, and the only links that I think would have been established would have been in the crucibles of those restaurants and cafes and snack bars. But that's just a guess. Stephen.
And also, like in terms of the neighborhoods, Chinese immigrants were living in the same neighborhood as the Lebanese immigrants were, right? Early 20th century, the Newgower Street neighborhood. So it's possible there was some interaction there, but we're just not aware of anything specific.
Thank you. And Clarence Thomas says that his grandfather Lim Kin arrived in Catalina in early 1900. And Jeannie Tom says that her father arrived by boat to BC and then to Nova Scotia from railroad and railroad to St. John's. And then Christina Simmons says, I was surprised to learn that the Chinese restaurants did not initially serve Chinese food. Why did that happen? How would the owners have learned to make Chinese or Canadian dishes, and when did they start to serve Chinese food?
That's a good question. Thanks, Tina. Okay, well, it's funny because like throughout North America, there actually was something called a chop suey craze that sort of went through places like San Francisco and New York. But for the most part, it didn't hit Newfoundland. So in fact, it tended to be something that you only found in the larger cities. In places like St. John's, and I would expect most other Canadian cities, mostly the Chinese immigrants were basically catering to what they thought people wanted to eat. Right? They are they're trying to reach a mass market. It was too soon, to try and introduce something as exotic as Chinese food to them. They want to make money. So the way you do that is by serving pork chops, mashed potatoes, and peas, right? And so that's basically what the Chinese restaurants in St. John's were serving right up until the 1950s. We saw one menu when we did it. We were involved in a group and we did an exhibit at the Center for Newfoundland Studies back about 10 years ago. And one of the photographs that we received for that was a picture of a menu from, I think it was from the American Cafe from the 1930s or 40s. And it had one small section of Chinese food on it. And it had like chop suey, it had a mushroom dish, and fried rice. And, nothing really, nothing really terribly adventurous, at least from our perspective. But that was it. And it's not really until the 1950s when what happens in the 1950s, it's a larger North American movement, that kind of the suburbanization of Chinese restaurants. And that's when they start introducing, the chicken balls and the fried rice and so on. So so basically no Chinese food in Newfoundland until the 1950s. As to where they learned to cook it, that's a good question. They probably learned from each other. So people within the Chinese community, some may have worked as domestic servants, where some of those skills may have picked it up from fellow countrymen who had spent time in North America and come back. But yeah, that is a really good question.
I was thinking maybe some could have possibly worked in other restaurants in some, not a cook capacity, but something else, and they might have learned it that way. It just occurs to me. Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so they did talk about bringing chefs in from other places, like a couple of those early Chinese restaurants. They mentioned bringing one of them brought a cook in from British Columbia, and someone else brought in a cook from Montreal. So it does suggest that they may be getting, they may be getting some experience from elsewhere. Another restaurant mentioned getting expertise from a cook who'd been in the United States, right? So been to other parts of North America and then.
Right, thank you. So Mary Chalker asks, was the Chinese population for or against Confederation?
Oh,
Don't
I
know.
have no idea. Don't know. Good question though. I mean, they couldn't vote, so most of them couldn't vote, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, see, I'm not really sure if they were aware of the, if they're aware of the 1947, lifting of the head tax, then maybe they would have been for Confederation. But our knowledge of what they were discussing amongst themselves is really quite limited. But a good thing to think about.
Jean Yi says, regarding Joan's question about who were the patrons of the Chinese laundry, as the daughter of a Chinese laundry owner, it was patronized by Anglos as they were able to afford it. And Wendy Lay says, I heard something about a prominent family in Bay Roberts with business ties to the Caribbean trading sugar and saltfish. Do you know something more about this?
I'm not familiar with that story, but certainly there were, Chinese people all around, like outside of, we were mostly talking about St. John's in this talk, but from very early times, there were prominent Chinese immigrants who set up businesses all around Newfoundland. There were certainly a number in Conception Bay, but yeah, I'll take a look. Use the census records to sort of track people. So I'll take a look and see what I find for Bay Roberts.
I was going to suggest, Miriam, that you stop sharing the screen so we can go to gallery mode and see one another. Okay.
And Irene Zadnik asks, was there a Chinese consulate or embassy in St. John's before Confederation?
I don't think so. There was that one visit in 1940 of with the Nickel Theater photo, but I don't think so.
Because he was the Canadian consulate, right? He wasn't Newfoundland consulate.
Okay. And Kwa Jin asks, was there much of a houseboy community aside from laundry and restaurants?
Not sure about that. I think William Ping, of course, was a houseboy to the Richard Squires, but outside of William Ping's experience, I couldn't say.
We don't see many reports of that, no. I mean, initially, some of the Chinese immigrants did have more diverse jobs. I mean, initially, some of them worked in the Bell Island mines, of course. And some were employed in the fishery for a little bit. And there may have been some other domestic service, but that really kind of, by about 1905, 1906, by that point, they're almost all working in laundry. You don't see much employment outside of that system.
And your Keith Story asks, were there many Chinese mine workers at the Bell Island mine in the late 1800s and early 1900s?
There were a few, but not many. Actually, there was a rumor in, I think, 1906, and this spurred on the debate about bringing in the head tax, because it was rumored that the mine was going to bring over 150 Chinese to work the mines. At the time, there was a labor shortage at Bell Island, but that didn't come to fruition. There was just a scattered number of Chinese there who were often taunted and picked up by their queue, which led a number of them to cut it, which you weren't supposed to do. But there were just a few.
And Carol asks, what is the most authentic Chinese restaurant in St. John's?
I don't know if there is one right now.
It depends on what you mean by Chinese. So such a diverse cuisine, right?
I mean, China is a pretty big country, and there are any number of ethnic variations within China. If you go north, of course, it's going to be hot. There's Cantonese style. There's Hong Kong style. Yeah, that's like saying authentic Newfoundland food. Well, that's Jake's dinner, I guess.
And Jeannie Tom, in answer to a previous question, says the Chinese and Jewish families were not permitted to have their businesses in the center of town in Corner Brook. Our families had businesses on the east and west sides of town. And Joan Hodson says, was the native Chinese dialect language written and spoken preserved through the generations?
Well, the people, so most of the people the Chinese people who came to Newfoundland, a lot of them came from, a small number of counties in Guangdong, like they call that the 4 counties or the 5 counties. And so they would have spoken those regional dialects, like Taishan dialect would have been a predominant dialect that was spoken in St. John's, and it's different from Cantonese. Like it's a variation of it, but it depended on which district of China they were from. And so yeah, they were. I mean, there were different Chinese dialects that were spoken in amongst the Chinese community in Newfoundland.
And then Wendy Lay asks, were there any Chinese fishermen?
Not that I'm aware of in looking through the census. Most were confined to essentially domestic trades, the cooking and cleaning. So,
And
don't think so.
And P.E. Courtesan asks, was there any association or relationship between the Chinese community here and elsewhere in Canada and the U.S. or the U.S.?
Yes. Oh, yes. And if you sort of look at some of the stories, like the individual family stories, you'll see, stories about, relatives from Vancouver, Ottawa, Boston. Yes. I mean, they are part of this larger, Chinese diaspora, spanned all over North America. And so many of the families in Newfoundland would have had connections, relatives, village connections throughout North America. So yes, there were very many, and some moved. I mean, there were, some who moved from Newfoundland to Boston, to the United States. Yeah, absolutely.
And Heidi Coombs asks, has there been much research into the Chinese community in Outport, Newfoundland, especially in terms of their contributions to food culture? Many major rural communities have a Tim Hortons, a Mary Brown's, and a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, well, there's William Ping's radio documentary. Is it Bayman's? Chicken Balls and Bayman? Is that it? You can just Google it, BBC. It's a podcast. He did it maybe a year or two ago. Yeah, that talks about sort of the food cultures of rural Newfoundland and Chinese restaurants. So look for that.
And Stephen Wollinet's comment that the food served by Chinese restaurants in the U.S. was not Chinese, but rather invented dishes like chicken chow mein and chop suey. It was only in the 60s that regional cuisines began appearing in larger cities. And Carol Haddad asks, Bob, did you say that anti-Chinese prejudice was more pronounced in Newfoundland during World War II, due in part to the presence of U.S. servicemen? A more contemporary example of Chinese paying the price when assumed to be Japanese was the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit by auto workers harboring anti-Japanese sentiments.
That's kind of two questions. As to the first one, I guess it's a function of numbers and a function of people from other parts of the world with and without their prejudices. Certainly, if you have many people with prejudice, you're going to have much more violence. That's just a guess, of course. I would imagine that many of the Chinese that were in St. John's were known and were at least tolerated. But many who came from elsewhere would have harbored feelings against others. But that would just be a guess. I can't ask them.
And also, it's the environment of the restaurants. Like people are drinking, and they're away. I mean, they're away from home. They are with other guys most of the time. They get into fights, and that's what a lot of the conflict was about. And in the restaurants during the war years, soldiers getting into a fight and starting breaking things up, or getting into a fight over women, or remember there's this one fight between think it was a Canadian and a Newfoundlander, and they were fighting because the Canadian had said something uncomplimentary about Newfoundland, and they ended up like smashing the windows and causing a lot of damage at this particular cafe that was owned by a Chinese man. So it was like, yeah, it's probably saying the numbers and alcohol. I think that that contributed to the increased violence at the restaurant during the war.
And both Jeannie and Jeannie Tom have just responses regarding language. Jean says dialects depended on which village you came from. The written language was always Chinese. And Jeannie says most of our families spoke, and I'm going to apologize for my pronunciation here, Toisan. For those of us born in Newfoundland whose parents and family members were still living, we could still converse in Toisan. And then yeah, the written language is the same for Chinese.
Yeah.
And then Jerry Cashin says, when I was a student nurse at the General Hospital in the late 60s, our nurses' caps and uniform belts were sent to a Chinese laundry on Aldershot to be laundered and starched. And
that's William Ping's laundry. Snow White laundry that he opened up. It was like one of the first like modern laundries. It was like mechanized as opposed to a hand laundry. But yeah, it was there for many years.
And Kira Loughran says, the Chinese who came at the turn of the century were almost exclusively from Guangdong province, Canton rather, from either the city of Guangzhou, which had a long history of mercantile trading with foreigners, or from the countryside, particularly the Pearl River Delta, who had a long history of work mostly as farmers and fishermen. They were used to providing what the foreigners wanted, hence the development of North American Chinese food, developed to suit the Western palate with the food available in North America. Irene Zadnik asks, in Saskatchewan, there was a law forbidding white women from working in Chinese businesses. Was there a similar law in Newfoundland?
No. There were some white women who did work in these restaurants, though. There was in the 40s, there was one big, it really got a lot of press attention because the woman got into a fight and stabbed the Chinese restaurant owner. And so it was all over the papers. And so that kind of brought a lot of attention to, the presence of women in Chinese restaurants. There's always that kind of suspicion that women in Chinese restaurants could be up to no good, so to speak. And there was always kind of surveillance, particularly during the war, of the constabulary was kind of keeping watch on these restaurants because they were afraid of, it was more stereotype than anything else. I mean, they were actually basing it on evidence, but sort of the assumption that women spending time in Chinese restaurants must be, sex workers or something like that. So yeah, there was that kind of stereotype kind of suspicion, but there was no law.
William Jin says, my father from China had the head tax ready and arrived by boat in BC and traveled across Canada by rail to Sydney, then boat to Port aux Basques, then rail to St. John's in June 1946. He worked at the Silver Ball, then opened up his Harvey Road snack bar. His wife was only allowed to enter after 1949 and arrived in St. John's by plane with her daughter to reunite with my father. And Jean Yi says, my understanding is the Chinese were permitted to be cooks and launderers because it was considered women's work and in essence, second-class citizens.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Kira Loughran says, I learned that the fish plant on Change Island was first owned or run by Chinese. I think it was in the 1950s. I'm wondering if they owned it or managed it, and if it was unusual at the time for Chinese to be in charge in that kind of way.
Yeah, I guess I never heard that story. Yeah, I think I'd be interesting to look into that. Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. Bob, have you ever heard of that?
I'm not sure. I haven't heard of it.
But yeah, certainly worth looking into.
And Marco Julie has her hand up again. Oh,
She's still on mute.
you've got to unmute yourself, Marco.
Thank you
Good.
for letting me ask another question. I work in the field of women's history, and I'm just so struck by the fact that the first Chinese men arrive and open laundries in St. John's in the early 20th century. And that is just the period in which middle and upper middle class women are beginning to complain about a shortage of women from the outports to perform domestic labor. And it seems to me it's just a straight line between the growth of Chinese laundries. I mean, really, if you think about the size of St. John's, and there were how many laundries? 30, what was it? Am I remembering the number? In a relatively short period of time, that clearly there's a substitution of labor going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. There was a time when most middle class families would have had a domestic servant, but that was changing. And one thing that's happening too is that there are some opportunities for women in industry in St. John's, like the rope walk and so on. There were places that employed women. So if they had other opportunities besides domestic service, they took it. So yeah, that's there's a direct correlation. In, the decline of domestic maids, if you like, and the rise of Chinese laundry.
And Marilyn Fradsham says William Jin mentioned his sister Bernice Jin. She was a MUN student at the physical education degree program. Do we know when other Chinese students began attending MUN? Oh, someone answers that farther down, early to mid 70s. That just popped up. And Heidi Kuhn says, where did the idea of a head tax come from? Was it from Canada?
American.
I'm guessing it would have been from Canada. There were different restrictions within the United States and in New Zealand and in Australia and South Africa. I don't think they had head taxes. All right. Canada might have been a unique situation to not only quell the import of Chinese labor, but to make them pay. It's just a guess.
And the last question is from Joan Hodson, who asks, were any Chinese employed in the laundry at the old Newfoundland Hotel?
I'm not aware. Yeah, I'm not aware of that. It's kind of interesting because the old Newfoundland Hotel was in some ways like a competitor, like in terms of its restaurant, like the Chinese restaurants in town. And there was a little bit of conflict over that during the war over an attempt to ban booths in Chinese restaurants. And there were some complaints because, well, Newfoundland Hotel had booths, and why aren't they being asked to take their booths out? And we are. But yeah, no, I haven't heard about anyone being employed. The thing is, like, just because when you look at the census, right, you can sort of tell where people are employed because where they live is usually where they are employed, right? Because you'll see an address, for a restaurant and a laundry, and they almost always lived upstairs or, in back. And so that's how you can tell sort of where Chinese people were working in that period. And I don't remember seeing any Chinese names attached to a location that wasn't, a laundry or a restaurant. So that's how you can sort of tell.
Okay, thank you very much, Miriam. Thank you, Robert. It's a great pleasure to thank both Miriam and Robert for their presentation. I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking them for what they presented to us tonight. And I certainly look forward to hearing more on this subject in the future, perhaps